Thank you, Shane. Thank you for having me. And that was a really beautiful video. It's true what Janet says about animals, and I think as a society we have forgotten that animals know a lot and that they were here for a lot longer before we were. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people and that their sovereignty never ceded in this country. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and acknowledge that without their hard work for justice, equality and recognition of our culture, I would not be here today. I would also like to acknowledge our future leaders, and I'm proud to see that there are many presenting throughout this conference. What an honour it is to have this work, Fluid Terrain, as the lead and provoking theme of museums and galleries in their cultural landscapes for this conference. This work would not have come about if it wasn't for curator Bruce McLean, a really deadly curator, a worthy man from the Beery Gubba Nation. And if it wasn't for his vision and in his exhibition, My Country, I Still Call Australia Home, from Black Australia in 2013, a show that has continued to exhibit nationally and internationally ever since, and no doubt provoked lots of conversations, critical thinking and deep listening. Oh, goodness, all right. At the time, I never would have imagined my work at this scale, and without Bruce's vision and support as a curator, I would never have been enabled to do such a thing. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it is my understanding that this was Bruce's first exhibition after 10 years of employment in this institution. And so when we're thinking about changing and challenging actions of museum and art galleries, I personally believe this is a really critical thing to consider. I can't help but wonder how many more Aboriginal artists and communities could also create art and conversations to this magnitude, as well as contribute wider and open discourses to museums and art galleries and gallery practice at large. So, I'm Megan Cope. My father's family is from Minjerribah. We are Nuna, Kulnuki and Gurrumpul people of Quandamooka country. And for those of you who are not familiar with our country, if you go down to the river and head east on this big tidal river, Maiwa, head towards its mouth, you will arrive at our country, and we are saltwater people. I've been practicing now for about 10 years, full time. And over the next set of few slides, I would like to share with you that journey that my art has taken me, and also my family and our community at large as Aboriginal people. So my practice is very much informed about place, environment, concepts of ownership and identity, and how these things intersect, connect, and inform us of who we are as Australians. This is something that I feel is still quite malleable in terms of our colonial history. And I found that my work over the last 8 years has informed me just as much as I've informed it. And my practice, each work leads into the next work and informs the next work. So, when we talk about history, culture and identity, I can't help but talk about my father and the impact that he has had and influence on my life. When I was really young, he was a single father, and we spent a lot of time together travelling up and down the coast. He followed work, and we often stayed with relatives, mostly blackfellas, and camped out in a panel van. This is back in the days when camping was free, and the bush was actually my living room. So I grew up learning histories, stories, and place names that I eventually realised later in life were quite contrary to what we learn at school. I guess it's only natural then that when I became an artist, I really wanted to challenge the myths that persist in the school curriculum, especially when it comes to concepts of ownership and land tenure, the things that, you know, I grew up knowing about our history as Aboriginal people. I guess a significant moment of clarity came to me when I was teaching at QCA many years ago, when I noticed that most of the students did not know or believe that the place across the river that we know as the city of Brisbane is on Aboriginal land. Many did not wish to recognise this. So that made me think about how I could respond to this and begin to present our epistemologies through landscape and language in a contemporary way. Under colonialism, Indigenous peoples have struggled against a Western view and have been complicit within that view. We've often allowed our histories to be told and have become outsiders as we've heard them being retold. Schooling is directly implicated in this process. And through the curriculum and its underlying theory of knowledge, early schooling redefined the world and where Indigenous peoples were positioned within that world. Maps of the world have also reinforced ourselves on the periphery, even though we are still considered to be part of the empire. So I guess that, you know, my practice at large is very much underpinned by what Linda Tuhiwar Smith wrote in Decolonising Methodologies. This was a moment that really transformed and allowed all of my childhood knowledge, the things that I'd learned at university, and the current everyday experience of being Aboriginal collided and then manifested in a new way of mapping practices, I guess. I began researching early maps of my country to start with, mostly parish maps that were made throughout the 1800s, and then military surveys that were commissioned by the government during World War I and World War II. I found that there was a stark contrast between the parish maps and the military maps, particularly in the recording and presence of Aboriginal place names. So that made me reflect on the social landscape during which these maps were created, and where Aboriginal people were positioned within this space. This was also a time when white Australia policy was being enforced, and also a time when many Australians felt the threat of invasion. So, you know, place names are always indicative of the dominant culture. Oh, thank you. That's great. And current economic beneficiaries within geographical landscapes or geopolitical landscapes. Excuse me, it's a bit warm. So, I started to think about the importance of toponyms and toponymy. And for us as Aboriginal people, place names are often indicative of resources connected to land, sea and sky, as well as creation stories, trade routes and family lines, both traditional and contemporary. So toponyms and place names are an important aspect of culture and identity because they provide a place and a location where history, events, landscapes and people are remembered, celebrated and most importantly continued. Here is an early map of my country. I wanted to start employing a process of decolonising our familiar landscapes and the built environment as we know it today, and begin to create a dual landscape that is inclusive of our language and imagining our culture as perhaps the first thing we see, the first thing to inform the way we navigate through internal and external landscapes and create multi-layered views. So that's why you'll find that all the language is still there, the English language, but I have reversed the view and dominant view of Aboriginal language. Another layer of this series is the projected sea level rise of about 5 metres. This is another form of decolonising and potential futuristic landscape to highlight our vulnerability in the land of fire and flood, while simultaneously connecting Indigenous knowledge systems of timekeeping and geomorphology on a deeper level. Many people sometimes think that Indigenous creation stories are fables or myths, but they are often deeply connected to real life and geological time and events. Our families have stories from a time when the area that we know as Moreton Bay was in fact a valley. Knowledge has been passed through generations orally and through art and music. This information has been verified by geologists who estimate the valley began flooding 18,000 years ago and reached its present state approximately 6,500 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows that our people and our ancestors were living in southeast Queensland at least 20,000 years ago at the conservative minimum. So I guess in many ways I got thinking about how do I transfer this knowledge into a contemporary context that can enable non-Aboriginal people to perhaps experience or consider the ways that we remember time and history. And Western culture is so obsessed with the future, so it felt very natural to want to project a futuristic sea level rise so that people could implicate themselves within that space and consider these things. This is a work from 2014 from a show called Twice Removed. So this includes both parish maps and military maps. I guess I'd be really interested now to just share with you the evolution of my practice, and that it hasn't sort of been limited to painting, especially over the last few years. I've started to look at landscape and ways of talking about erasure and making the invisible visible in different ways now, still using geology and connections to country, but in different materials. Before I go there, I now live in Naarm in Melbourne, and this is a little painting of Port Melbourne, the place of the Yalawilum people. I've learnt that from the Boomerang elder Auntie Caroline Briggs, Arweed, about their sea rising stories, and I think it's really important to note that this is not just something that my family know about, and that this is actually, I wouldn't be surprised if not all coastal people have these stories. So I've also learnt that the airport that we fly into when we go to Tullamarine is actually named after an Aboriginal man. Here is an illustration of Tullamarine and his friend Gingin escaping from jail and after setting it on fire. And when I look at this drawing, one thing that strikes me is not only the kind of grief and loss that's occurring, with the desecration of the landscape there, those big trees have fallen down, but how much these fellas look like superheroes with their possum skin cloaks as they are running away from the colonisers. I've not only limited these concepts to geological maps and parish maps, but also geological maps, and especially since I've been in Melbourne, Naarm, and began to look deeper into the history of that country and also how the empire obtained its wealth from the fact that the Kulin nation kept their country in pristine conditions until invasion. What we see here are two maps, one on the left of Warrawarang country and Jajawarang country, and this is Bendigo and Ballarat, two centres in which most of Australia's gold was extracted, and thus why the British Empire became one of the wealthiest empires during that time. I think it's really, really important to connect these histories and these layers of time and consider how Aboriginal people have been positioned within that landscape, and where that connects us to how we are positioned today. Whether it be, it doesn't matter what space, whether it being an art gallery or a museum or in the workplace or walking down the street. So, again, looking at toponyms and the power of language and landscape. This is a work that I did a long, long time ago in 2009 at the War Fort down there at the Brisbane River mouth, Fort Lytton. And at the time I developed a soundscape and projection work where I recorded my cousin's war song, and I played it on the periphery of the war fort, and and also projected the word Turrbal with Turrbal country, which I didn't really think of at the time, connected with the oil refinery behind. The view you see here is from within the barracks, and looking out over through the sniper range. I really like this image and this development. I guess when we look at topographical spaces, I feel like there is some kind of distance that is necessary when you are confronted with these sorts of concepts of ownership. But, as an artist, when I do this over and over again, you kind of want to keep challenging yourself and, challenging your practice. So I think it was only natural to start looking at, to build on the projections. And this is one from down on Yugambeh country. Considering the power of applying language to materials or compositions of land formations that we may not consider Aboriginal because they've been altered in a modern context. This is another one down on... So as you can see, there's quite a contrast when you apply language to built and natural surfaces. Sometimes I just like to have a bit of fun, but also always serious. There was an exhibition called Dead Ringer in Pika in Perth, curated by Lee Robb, and it was all about fear and ghosts and time and history. And I decided to make a site-specific response to the fear that is described in the records of the white people when they were in Australia and how terrified they were. And often it was this fear that drove them to erase our people from the landscape. And so I decided to make this little site-specific work. What you see is, I have to describe the experience in the gallery. This was on the top level, and as you walk through the bottom, occasionally these really, really high, powerful flashes of light would occur somewhere. You would only see it sort of in your periphery. And by the time you went to look at where the light came from, this light had charged a little text-based work that I'd applied to the wall, which said "boo," and I really like playing with those sorts of ideas of fear, because fear does motivate us to do some really great things sometimes and some really terrible things too. So here is another work that I've made in Melbourne, and another example of how art can kind of transform landscape and our position within that space. This is about 37 metres long, and is at the Australian Catholic University on Brunswick and Victoria Parade in Fitzroy. This is the front part. So all sides of the buildings connect to the people, place names and language groups within the metropolitan space, within the highly built up environment. These people are still there and their stories are rich and alive. And I'm very lucky to be able to have experiences and learn these things with this mob now that I'm down there. I just wanted to talk about another way of thinking about country. This was a work that I really enjoyed doing. It was a collaboration with marine biologist Roberta Johnson, and we just installed it last year in December. What we wanted to do was talk about climate change, about sea level rises and ocean acidification. So what we did was we would get together and we'd eat seafood, and we'd cut cabbages and boil cabbages because red cabbage juice is a natural pH reader. And what we wanted to do was create, to talk about rising sea level and ocean acidification over a map. And so what we did was we deposited little bits of acid, household stuff like detergent, bicarb soda and citric acid, things that are very common, that all go into the ocean from our daily lives. And what happened over the period of 32 hours was this cabbage juice iceberg melted over the land and sea and revealed like a litmus test of ocean acidification. So the pink levels are very low levels of acid, and the green is very high pH. Here's a little close-up as it began to melt, and then what happened was the shells formed a midden on the landscape, which is something I've also been obsessing about over the last few years. And so I've decided to start recreating middens and shell piles to, I guess, further connect with how important it is to actually have physical presence, cultural presence, beyond, just a physical presence. So I started looking at middens, and I started looking at the middens from my country, and I found out that many of the middens at the time of colonisation were excavated, and that this was in fact sort of the beginning of the mining process in Australia. Not just on my country, it happened everywhere, but of course these concepts always come or stem from my country. So I began to think about ways that I could talk about this process and what it actually means to physically erase these sorts of markers that were actually, when we look at middens now, they're often just footprints, or they're quite small, or you don't really know that they're there unless you know that they're there and you know what you're looking for. And I had sort of taken it for granted that that's what middens were. It wasn't until I started to read about the desecration of these sites that I realised and reimagined the grandeur that they once were before they were mined. The reason they were mined was to be turned into lime to make cement to build the foundations of the colonial buildings. So it was very important for me to sort of start talking about, one thing being replaced by another, and that's kind of how colonialism works, I guess. Its primary function is elimination. So what I've done here is I've started a process of hand casting oysters with cement and lodging them in the materials that are still extracted from my country, which is now ilmenite and mineral sands. This was another part of that same exhibition, and another way of me talking about culture, one culture being replaced with another. These beer cans are lodged in silica sand, which is also mined from my country. This work went to Jerusalem, and the Palestinian people there invited me to come and extract earth with them and create a midden with their country as a way of acknowledging that these stories and these things don't just, that we have a connection there. So the most recent work is, I guess, the next level of reformation, and this is a huge midden that I made for the National at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I really wanted to take it to the next level. Previously, I guess the presentations of the middens were not really to the level that I wanted to see. But, as an artist, we often are limited by our own resources. So with this opportunity, I thought I'd go for it and try and make 12,500 concrete oysters, hand cast from Sydney rock oysters. This work is called Reformation Part 3 because it's the third work, and it is called Double Gully because it connects to the site of one of the largest middens that have been recorded in Australia that was at the site of the Sydney Opera House today. It's been recorded that that midden was 10 metres high and 100 metres long, and that was reduced to cement or material for cement. So I think it's really, really important to kind of reimagine these things and reimagine our landscapes. Even though things have changed, we can actually still remember these things and incorporate them into our everyday thinking and way of being. This is a closer view. And I'll finish up now with a beautiful photograph of a Quandamooka midden, which was another source of inspiration and motivation to go in that direction in my work. This photograph is courtesy of of Liz Gondway at North Stradbroke Island Museum, and this formation is no longer on my country. I think I'll wrap it up, and and I'd be very happy to take questions if anyone has any. I'll just drink some water first.
There are some mics too. Thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you.
There are some roving mics, so if people want to put up their hands if they have any questions for Megan, please go right ahead. I'm interested interested, Megan, I'll start things off. Can people hear me? No. I was saying, if you have a question, please put up your hand. Thank you very much for that insight into your very, very important work, Megan, and I think it will be of great interest for everyone here who hasn't encountered it before, and great to get further insight today. The connection too with how spaces and places outside and indeed underneath our institutions can be actually brought inside to the space of the museum is my question, I suppose. I'm interested in how putting that work on the glass of the museum here, and how installing your work in the Art Gallery of New South Wales felt for you, because I see in your work an act of re-inscription, if you like, and to actually be doing that inside a museum or gallery environment, is that actual process one that you could tell us about?
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me how many people have never considered these things, and or met an Aboriginal person. So it is really important that museums and art galleries enable Aboriginal people with this agency to be able to, bring this into these spaces. Not for the obvious reasons, but also that so we can actually continue to tell our stories. I think that with that work, what was really, I guess the most powerful thing was connecting or transcending time, at Goma. You could look through that window and see the buildings there in Mianjin and look through that map and, I guess consider your implication within that space, and that's really, really important. With the middens, I'm now kind of obsessed with, going one step further, and it's a great feeling to apply these concepts to Western architectural forms and house them within those spaces. But also I want to start thinking more about Aboriginal architecture and how we can, start to have that conversation about houses and these sorts of concepts, that, we probably haven't considered as extensively as we could in an art environment.
Any further questions for Megan?
There's one or two.
And then one down the front.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was really amazing. My question is whether you know the work of Kevin O'Brien, and whether you guys were working at the same time, aware of each other's practice, whether you ever worked together?
Yeah, I do know Kevin, and I think he's a legend. I think that, in terms of our community and the work that we are making, it's not just the individuals that actually interest me so much. It's the collective histories and all of these stories together, and all this work that we are doing together that is, defying the empire in so many ways. And I love Kevin's practice because he is, as an architect, talking about these concepts as well, and actually challenging, how we experience place and how we, remember Aboriginal philosophies and spiritual systems and practices. Yeah, he's great.
Hi Megan, my name's Gilda. I just think it's wonderful to hear you talk about your work in this way, particularly after we saw the two young guys from the, Digi Youth Arts talk about the culture wars and play it out for us. It's almost as if your work is the bringing together of these two characters. The middens and the mining of middens, I can really see a clear analogy with the collection of lots of Indigenous material culture that, if you like, form the fabric of some of our institutions, including mine, the National Museum of Australia. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on that analogy. You speak of it in an architectural sense, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us your thoughts about that.
I guess I'm still in the thick of this obsession. The first thing that I felt when I started to read and realise the grandeur of the middens that once were was a real sense of mourning, and how it's actually going to take us another 10,000 years to build these forms back into the landscape. That is if we have connection and our land back, So these are the sorts of things I think about. In terms of museums and galleries and their commitment to cultural practice and maintaining visibility and culture within these institutions, I think it's really, really important to, maintain relationships with community and actually get outside of the institution as well, so that these things can be brought back in and not imported. Like as artists, and practitioners, we're often viewed as resources or tools that can be imported into the space. I think that we need to get out there, because it's not until you're in the land and experiencing country that these sorts of things and these sense of timelessnesses start to be felt in the human way. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay.